Hi, this is Mike Benoit with Tyranny Busters. We're going to unwind some more tyranny upon the mind of man, some of the psychobabble of Stefan Molyneux. And basically, this video is covering the ground where he talks about child spanking and daycare, mothers putting their kids in daycare. Unwinding psychobabble is not the easiest thing in the world because it sounds all flowery and you spew a theory and it sounds wonderful and boy, no one should hit a kid and et cetera, et cetera. In the term using hitting a kid is put out there as if you're beating the crap out of the kid. And so, boy, we're going to outlaw all kinds of corporal punishment and the world will be a better place. So, which doesn't include the different circumstances that might come up. So we're going to evaluate 10 minutes of this video that's an hour and 3 minutes long. And it's Stefan Molyneux interviewing somebody from Sweden. And the title is, I Did the Best I Could. Okay, here we go.
Study, was that a valid excuse? Did you get an A?
Yeah, but then they told me that I had a test, and they told me what information that there was going to be on the test. So if there was something they didn't tell me that was on the test, you could complain and get points back.
Okay, so what is an example where, because I always hear this in terms of parents, right? And if you're a parent, you have at least 9 months warning, or 8, I guess, if the kid's going to be born a little early, but you have at least 9 months warning to get ready to be a parent, and you can read the books and you can get up to speed on the latest and greatest. And so I don't see how parents can claim that they just get 9 months to study for a test. It's the most important test you're ever going to have. And then if people say, well, I never got around to reading a parenting book, it's like, well, then you can't claim a lack of knowledge.
All right, well, not just I never got around to reading a parenting book. He's comparing one test about the Battle of Gettysburg versus a test on parenting, which encompasses thousands, hundreds of thousands of different scenarios and possibilities that could come up, that they're just totally new and different. You could read for 10 years books on parenting, and you'd have situations come up and you don't know the answer for it. You're just going to do the best you can when that situation pops. But you can't, bottom line is you can't compare preparing for one test and the consequences or the scope of parenting for 20 years. Totally different animals.
As an excuse.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. But most tests will tell you, most teachers will tell you what to study. But then, with the parenting book.
This would be parenting.
Yeah.
Right? There's lots of parenting books out there, and the vast majority of them talk about how to negotiate with your kids, how to reason with your kids. They don't just sit there and say, hit them with this book, buy a hardcover if it's a boy, right? That's not how parenting books work. I mean, for the last, since Benjamin Spock's book of baby and child care, there's been very, very strong negotiation over spanking recommendations. So that's 60 years. 60 years.
So he's saying there's lots of parenting books out there, but really, what do those parenting books say? And how many of them contradict one another? And as if this is some sort of subject that you can just sit there and read a book and boy, you got it down to a science. And then does it deal with all the different ramifications, possibilities, and circumstances? No, it doesn't. In fact, some of these books, wasn't it Spock that said you shouldn't breastfeed your kids when he first came out? I may be wrong about that. So, but that's it. And then again, he's starting to hit that realm of hitting your kids. Like if a kid reaches into the fire and you smack the hand, to him, that's the same thing as if a kid drops a piece of food on the floor and the mother smacks the kid in the face, across the face. To him, he's calling them the same thing.
People have seen television shows, right, where people who hit their kids are roundly excoriated, right? Dr. Phil has had the biggest self-help show, a daytime show on television for like over 10 years. And he's constantly telling people how to negotiate with their kids. This is true of almost all the self-help shows that I've ever seen. Plus, people have seen sitcoms going back from the 1950s. Leave It to Beaver and so on, where the parents negotiate and don't hit their kids. So for a little over 60 years, which is quite a long time really, a little over 60 years, there has been massive amounts of media and information and books and experts and radio shows and television shows and sitcoms and so on, all showing the same thing, which is how to reason with and negotiate with your kids rather than hit them. So for people to say, I didn't know it was wrong.
You know what? And of course, even you go back to the days where maybe kids got a whooping once a month. 999,000 other situations during the month were all done by reason and negotiation. But the parent thought that circumstance, the whooping was called for. And back in time, back in history, let's say somebody left the barn door open and the livestock escaped, and that meant starving for the winter. Well, you know what? A little switch out in the back, well, called for it. But again, somebody drops a piece of food on the table and gets beat, or somebody leaves the door open for a second and gets beat. See, these things are relevant to the circumstance that's involved. Again, a child putting a hand in a dangerous place, doesn't know any better, can't reason with a child, smacking the hand, the child gets this message, oh, I shouldn't do that. And so to make this a carte blanche thing, yeah, some people use the beating and the hitting and this abuse and abusive mental things constantly, but to say that you can never use corporal punishment is just as ridiculous as you should always beat your kids if they don't do what you want them to do.
Didn't know it was a problem is ridiculous. I mean, that literally willing yourself to not see that which is in front of you, right? Whatever god-awful things Bill Cosby seems to have been up to since, at least the Cosby Show, along with Family Ties, along with Full House, along with you name it, these shows, they all talk about how to reason with your kids, how to negotiate with your kids. Sometimes it's a little heavy-handed. In the Cosby Show in particular, Felicia Rashad could turn into quite a she-witch, but they still weren't hitting their kids. And so for people to say, well, I had no idea, I was like, of course you did. And there's a reason why these sitcoms don't show hitting kids. It's because when people see kids getting hit, when they're not currently in a state of dissociated rage, it's morally horrifying to them. Everybody knows how bad hitting kids is, which is why if any sitcom ever showed a full-on spanking of a child, people would faint. They would.
Yeah, well, of course the sitcoms aren't going to show a full-on spanking of a child because the situations that they're dealing with, none of them merit that. So, and of course that's wrong when a full-on spanking of a child occurs when the situation doesn't merit it. But let's say the child was doing something very dangerous, like playing with matches and propane gas tank, and the child was not in condition to reason with. And the only way to stop a child from blowing up the house was a spanking without causing any physical damage to the body. What will Stefan Molyneux require? That the law, the state that he is against because he's an anarchist, will put out a law that says if you do that, you the parent, you will be put in prison and subject to all the abuses that prisoners will lay on one another and the prison guards will lay on one another. To make this a blanket condemnation of any kind of corporal punishment is as ridiculous as using corporal punishment for the most minor of crimes.
Scream, advertisers would leave in droves, so they would get letters of protest, they'd get boycotts, they'd get God knows what, right? I mean, the entire careers of everyone involved would be completely toast because you have to be in a state of dissociated rage and cold sociopathic anti-empathy in order to strike a child. And when you're sitting in front of a sitcom...
Totally false. You can strike a child without any rage, without any of the psychopathical garbage that he's talking about. I have 2 children. One of them got a spanking. One time, she got herself unbuckled in the back seat of the car, in not the back seat, but her child seat. Got herself out of it and was just merrily going around the back seat. And even after I instructed her to get back in the car seat, I pulled over to the side of the road, gave her little butt a swat, and put her back in the car seat and said, "Don't you ever do that again. That's very dangerous." Okay, well, Stefan Molyneux, I'm a child abuser. Terrible. So there are circumstances. And to act like there aren't any that are appropriate is just, again, asinine.
You know, having a decaf and having a couple of laughs, if you see when you're in an unprepared state, when you're in a not dissociated homicide, you're not in a dissociated rage state, if you see somebody hitting a child, it scalds you to the core because you've not mentally jacked yourself into the play.
Scalds me to the core when I see somebody, and I saw a friend slap a child in public across the face for a minor infraction. Doesn't scald me to the core when I see someone smack somebody's hand because they were doing something that was inappropriate. Sorry.
Where somehow your self-righteous rage, your inner parental alters have taken over, and you can pull that kind of crap and feel justified. If it hits you out of nowhere, it's horrifying. And so everybody knows. I mean, if people were comfortable with spanking, it would be all over the sitcoms, and it never is.
I'm not so sure that everybody knows, because I think this show is the first show that told me that you should read a parenting book before you have kids. Most people just assume that they know that their parents were good enough teachers, or that, yeah.
And what's your cultural background there, brother?
I'm Swedish.
Yeah, well, the answer, everybody knows. Not everybody knows that spanking is wrong or horrible, like this guy is saying, because there's appropriate circumstances for it. When punishment matches the danger or the crime, it's not horrifying. When the punishment goes to the minor infraction, like I used as an example before, dropping of a piece of food on the ground and a smack across the face like nobody's business, or I got a smack across the back of my head because I didn't finish a plate of food at a restaurant my dad picked me up from, a plate of food that I purchased with my own money that I earned. That is outrageous, okay? But somebody sticking their hand into someone else's plate of food and getting a smack for it is not outrageous. And you've got to evaluate these circumstances. And this collectivist viewpoint that this guy spews more than is imaginable is beyond me.
And I've spent like 3 years in the US.
Now, Sweden was one of the earliest countries to ban spanking, right?
Yes.
In the 70s?
Yeah.
And what's Swedish parenting like? I don't know much about it.
There is no hitting, and it's. I don't really know if my parents are like the ideal Swedish parents, if you know what I mean.
I don't know what you mean, because I don't know what the ideal Swedish parents are.
Most Swedes are pretty passive. They're like conflict avoidant. That the Swedish parenting, I would guess, is there's some neglect when the kids are young. Like the kids are usually put in daycare pretty early, like from like 1-2 year old. And then the parents usually don't talk to their children as much as I've heard you talk to your daughter.
Oh no! Listen, I mean, I don't want to tell tales out of history or whatever, but I certainly would not put my family right at the center of the curve when it comes to quality conversations.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that, like, if parents don't do what I do, that's automatically damned. Of course, right? I mean, I had to work a lot to sort of figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
But I guess the question for me would be, if a parent drops a child off at daycare, is the child very unhappy? Because
now he's switching from corporal punishment to the terrible, horrible tragedy of children going to daycare. And we're going to only have about 3 minutes more of this, so bear with me.
That's important, right? I mean, if the child is miserable in daycare, or at least it doesn't want to go, and of course, what child wants to go to daycare?
What child wants to go to daycare? Well, it depends on the daycare, Stefan Molyneux, and a lot of them are fun, entertaining, and they got good people running them, and they get to play with other kids, and they love to go, okay? So, they're kind of like pretty well-balanced kids. And so it's like sending a child to daycare is not sending them to prison. Now, some of them are pretty bad, and when the parents make decisions and they don't pick a good daycare, that's a problem. But let's let you spew about how terrible women are when they drop their kids off at daycare.
God, of all the crazy things in the world, this is the womb I grew up in. These are the tender hands, soft voice, and crying eyes that first greeted me into this world. These are the boobs I well know and love. This is the body smell and the hair smell and the odors that I'm familiar with. This is the comfortable nesting place of my earliest existence. This is the only person I'm fundamentally familiar with. And what possible benefit could it be to a baby to go into a daycare? It just takes a moment's thought. This isn't, got to split the atom in your spare time using popsicle sticks.
What possible benefit? And you say baby. Now, what kind of baby are you talking about? 1 month old? Yeah, sure. Wait, what if you got a year and a half old child? Some people still call them a baby. And, they're toddling around, walking around. They kind of like being with other babies. There's a possible benefit there for you. I know it's hard for you to see.
And Elmer's glue, this is like, okay, what is the upside of a kid going into daycare? What is the benefit? Why would they want to do it? What's better than mom and home and familiarity and a connection? It's like saying, well, I could go out with my wife for her 10th anniversary, or I could hire some stranger off the street to go out with her. I'm sure she won't care. Of course she will.
Yeah, how's it like saying that? That's like saying, I can't have a cup of coffee with a friend because, why would I have a cup of coffee with a friend when all my time should be with my wife? The child, all the time should be with mom and dad. They shouldn't have associations with other people? Of course not.
Yeah, well, I guess the Swedish society it's subsidizing daycare. So it's very cheap to put your kids in daycare, so you could make money by going out working. And it's also, I don't think anyone thinks that daycare is bad.
Well, they haven't read the studies then. So in Quebec here, Quebec is a province here in Canada where they speak what some people charitably call French.
Some people charitably call French. They haven't read the studies then, because if they had read the studies about the psychobabble studies, then they realized how terrible and how bad daycare was. Okay.
Exposure, this study, we'll put a link to this below. Exposure, this is directly from the study. It turns out that exposure to childcare in Quebec negatively impacts children in both short and long terms. Compared with their peers in other provinces, young Quebecois children had higher rates of anxiety, aggression, and hyperactivity. Now, Quebec has very cheap subsidized daycare, the other provinces not so much. This is why they compared with other provinces. As teenagers...
Could the problem be the subsidized daycare and that the state is in control of the daycare instead of the people with their own pocketbook? Could that possibly be the problem? No, you're just going to make it daycare is the problem.
These children commit more crimes. and were generally less satisfied with their lives. The program had no long-term positive effect on children's standardized test scores or cognitive abilities, and may even have had a negative effect. So kids in daycare, higher rates of anxiety and aggression and hyperactivity. They commit more crimes and are generally unhappy, less happy with their lives. Doesn't help their test scores, may have had a negative effect, may have made them dumber and more violent.
Okay, again, your daycare. Which one? These government subsidized daycares that the people really don't have to produce a good product, wasn't done from the free market. And so you're comparing those to kids that maybe got to go to, you don't call them daycares, you call them, they had nannies, or they had other individual attentions, or they had they went to private and they paid for things totally out of their own pocketbook and had a whole different sense of responsibility to their parents. But anyway, the socialist model of not hitting their kids and all this stuff is wonderful. This is 10 minutes of this nonsense, and you know, it's a whole hour he goes into this. But I'll just read something here about Sweden. And who knows about this statistic either? Who knows about any of it? Mental health and work, Sweden, says that mental health issues cost the Swedish economy nearly 8 billion euro per year, equivalent to 2.8% of GDP, through lost productivity, healthcare, social spending. Mental ill health accounts for 60% of all new disability claims and has become the leading cause of labor market exclusion among people of working age in Sweden. Young people are worse affected, with as many as 1 in 4 16 to 18-year-olds suffering from a mental disorder. Poor mental health is significantly more common among youth who are neither in work nor in education or training. Now, this poor mental health, let's see, how would Stefan Molyneux, he probably would say it's due to the daycare. The kids are raised in the daycare. It's not due to the fact that they didn't get any corporal punishment that was maybe appropriate when they needed it. They were just kids that were negotiating with the parents, and maybe they were better negotiators. And they were negotiated in such a way that they were less responsible. And being less responsible, maybe not quite as happy. Maybe they got away with whatever they wanted to get away with because, well, they didn't have to comply because the parents couldn't possibly use terrible tactics like timeout. Stefan Molyneux will talk about that as being a prison tactic, or a swat on the behind. But he'll probably say it's due to the terrible, terrible consequence of being put in daycare. And again, please, there's lots of differences in daycare. Huge difference between public school or government school and private school, and even a bigger difference than in homeschool. Yeah. So when you got good parents and the kids are well-rounded, and there's spanking is never used, or on a very rare occasion, and certainly not used when it's not appropriate, kids are going to typically be more balanced and whatnot. But there are situations where the parents can homeschool and they have to go to send their kids to government schools, especially if their production is confiscated through taxation, and yes, and put their kids in daycare, and hopefully they choose a good daycare where the kid has a nice rounded and they enjoy the experience. And there's no question about it that kids going to public school start out with a thirst for learning, and something happens to that by the time they finish up. So these government-run organizations certainly aren't the way to go. But this collectivist attitude by Stefan Molyneux, this one shoe fits every size, is just crazy. So And I didn't do a good timeshare, so when you were just listening to Stefan Molyneux, we'll see how this comes out. But that's all for now. I mean, yeah, you didn't get to see him on the screen, so I'll just see how this broadcast come out on that basis. Thanks for listening. This is Tyranny Busters. Let me know what you think.